Look at this. Boy's out here digging himself a swimming hole while the rest of us are hauling feed 40 miles a day.
Roy Del Higgins sat high in his truck window, engine idling, sunglasses pushed up on his hat brim so everybody could see his eyes rolling. In a drought, son. In the worst drought this county's seen since '54. Two of his ranch hands leaned against the truck bed, already grinning. Caleb kept digging. Dirt, then more dirt, his small shovel biting into ground gone hard as concrete under 3 months without rain. Hey, I'm talking to you. Higgins killed the engine and stepped down, boots crunching on dead grass. You know what that hole's gonna have in it come August? Nothing. Dust. Maybe a dead jackrabbit if you're unlucky. He looked past Caleb toward the ranch house. Your granddaddy know you're out here wasting daylight on this instead of helping him haul water. Caleb didn't look up. He'd learned, watching his grandfather deal with this man for 2 years running, that looking up just gave Roy Del Higgins a face to aim at. Tell you what, Higgins said, loud now, performing for his hands the way he always did. When that hole's still bone dry in September and your granddaddy's herd is down to nothing, you remember I offered to buy this place fair, back before it got to be a mercy. Y'all have a good one now. He climbed back in his truck and pulled off in a cloud of dust that settled over the hole. Caleb was digging like it was trying to bury the idea along with the boy. Nobody in that truck understood what that low, damp patch of ground actually was. Nobody in this whole drought-choked county did. They were about to find out, and when they did, it was going to cost Roy Del Higgins the one thing he thought no drought could ever touch: his control over every drop of water in this county. Now, to understand why a 10-year-old boy was digging a hole in the middle of the worst drought in 70 years, and why Roy Del Higgins laughing out that truck window was about to become the biggest mistake of his life, we have to go back 4 months, to a story an old man told his grandson one night that nobody else in this county remembered anymore. If you felt your blood boil watching a grown man laugh at a child trying to help his family survive a drought, hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment telling me what city, what country you're watching this from. I want to see how far this thing reaches before it's over, because the American farmer exists for exactly this moment. Stay with us, because what came up out of that hole, I promise you, was worth every second of what you just watched. Here's what you need to know. Caleb was 10 years old, living with his grandfather Walt on 140 acres that had run cattle since before Walt himself was born, out in a stretch of ranch country that hadn't seen real rain in 14 months. Caleb's parents were gone, his mother in a car accident when he was 4, his father lost to the same fentanyl crisis that had quietly gutted half the young men in that county. And Walt, 71 years old, widowed himself for 6 years, was the only family Caleb had left. And here's what nobody understood, not even Walt at first. 4 months earlier, sitting on the porch one hot night with the well pump groaning louder than it should, Walt had told Caleb a story his own father used to tell him, about a natural spring that used to surface on the low end of the property, decades before Walt was even born, before a drought back in the 1930s shifted the water table, and the spring went dry and got forgotten, plowed over, grown up in grass until nobody living remembered exactly where it used to be. Your great-great-grandfather used to say water don't disappear, Walt told him. It just goes looking for a different way up, someplace close to where it always was. Caleb didn't say much back. He was 10, but he'd noticed something that summer that Walt, busy fighting the drought on every other front, hadn't paid attention to. There was one patch of ground on the low end of the property, maybe 30 feet across, where the cattle always gathered even when there was nothing there to eat or drink, even in the worst of the dry months. Even when Walt hauled water to every other trough on the property, and the cattle still wandered back to that one spot and just stood there. That's when everything changed, because Caleb started digging. Not because he understood water tables or aquifers or anything close to it. He was 10. What he understood was simpler. His great-great-grandfather had never been wrong about that land, not once in 4 generations, and if the water was just looking for a different way up, somebody had to help it find one. He had no idea he was digging toward an underground vein that ran clear onto Roy Del Higgins' land, too. The same vein Higgins' own wells had been quietly pulling from for 15 years. The same vein Higgins controlled almost entirely because nobody else in the county had a legal claim to it. Nobody had won because nobody else even knew it was there. And here's where it gets worse, because Roy Del Higgins didn't need to guess how bad things had gotten on Walt's ranch. He had someone telling him directly. Gus Delacroix, Walt's ranch hand for 11 years, his army buddy going back to Vietnam, a man who'd sat at Walt's kitchen table more nights than Caleb could count. For the past 6 months, every time Walt fell behind on hay, every time the herd count dropped after a hard culling, every time the water co-op's emergency allocation left Walt's troughs running dangerously low, Gus had been repeating it back to Higgins' ranch foreman over beers at the feed store, in exchange for a standing promise. A steady paycheck at Higgins' outfit, waiting for him the day Walt's ranch finally went under. Gus told himself it wasn't betrayal. He told himself Walt was going to lose the ranch to the drought eventually anyway, and a man his age had to think about his own retirement too. He had no idea, mentioning Caleb's little hole he's been digging to Higgins' foreman almost as a joke one evening, what he just handed over. Nobody did, not yet. And it didn't stop at that first drive-by. That's the part that should make your blood boil, because Roy Del Higgins made a show of it for weeks afterward, every chance he got. At the feed store the following Saturday, he told a group of ranchers, loud enough for it to carry, that the Kessler boy's out there digging a mud puddle while his granddaddy's herd starves, and that he'd offered Walt a fair buyout twice already, out of neighborly concern. Laughter followed, the same easy laughter that always seemed to travel with Higgins wherever he went. At the county water co-op meeting the following week, Higgins stood during public comment and, dripping with false concern, suggested the board take a hard look at whether some of these smaller operations can even survive this drought responsibly. A comment aimed squarely at Walt, in a room full of people who knew exactly who he meant and said nothing. Walt stopped attending those meetings after that. He focused on hauling water, on culling the herd down to what he could actually keep alive, and he let Caleb keep digging in the evenings after chores, telling himself it was probably nothing, a grieving boy's project, harmless enough to leave alone. But here's what nobody knew yet, not even Walt. 6 feet down, in ground that hadn't seen groundwater in 90 years, Caleb's shovel was starting to hit soil that was cool. Not just cool, damp. Here's where the system started working against them, exactly the way it always had. The county water co-op's emergency drought allocation, distributed monthly to member ranches based on herd size and acreage, quietly cut Walt's allotment by 1/3 that month. An adjustment, the co-op notice called it, signed off by a 3-member allocation committee that Roy Del Higgins had chaired for the past 6 years. Walt's formal appeal request got logged as pending further review. The same week Higgins' own operation received an increase. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly the way Roy Del Higgins had spent 6 years building it to work for him, and against any small operation that might not survive long enough to need water from him at all. And nobody on that co-op board saw what was coming next, because at that point, not even Caleb understood what he was about to pull up out of that hole with his own 2 hands. Now here's the part that's going to make you sick, because it's not Roy Del Higgins. It's someone Walt trusted like family. Gus came by that evening, same as always, offering to help finish the evening chores, asking how the water allocation appeal was going, how many head Walt figured he could keep through August. And Walt, exhausted, worried, still trusting the man who'd fought beside him decades ago, told him everything. The allocation cut, the stalled appeal, and almost as an afterthought mentioned that Caleb's hole had hit damp soil that week, said it half joking, not really believing it meant anything. Gus didn't think much of it in the moment. He mentioned it to Higgins' foreman the next day at the feed store, same as he'd mentioned everything else, casual, offhand, not even thinking it mattered. He had no idea what he just handed over. Because when Higgins heard damp soil, low end of the Kessler property, near the old fence line, his stomach dropped in a way it hadn't dropped in 15 years. He knew exactly what ran under that stretch of ground because his own wells, on the far side of that fence line, had been quietly drawing from the same underground vein for a decade and a half, under a water claim that had never once been challenged, because nobody else had ever known there was anything there to challenge. And Roy Dell Higgins was not a man who was going to let a 10-year-old boy with a shovel threaten that without a fight. Caleb didn't know Higgins had found out. What he knew was simpler. The soil at the bottom of his hole had gone from damp to genuinely wet in the span of a week, and by the second week of July, standing waist-deep in his own dugout pit, he'd felt something no 10-year-old expects to feel in the middle of a historic drought. Cold mud between his toes. He ran to get Walt. Walt stood at the edge of that hole for a long time, saying nothing before he finally climbed down himself, knelt in the wet dirt, and pressed his palm flat against the seep starting to pool at the bottom. "Well, I'll be damned," he said quietly. "Your great-great-granddaddy wasn't lying." Here's what nobody told them outright, though it would matter soon enough. That same week, the County Water Co-op's engineering consultant, a contractor Higgins had used for years, quietly requested an updated topographic survey of the broader Miller Creek watershed area. A request that, for the first time in over a decade, happened to include the boundary line between Higgins' property and Walt's. Walt wasn't just fighting a drought anymore. He was being watched. Walt did what any careful rancher would do. He called the State Geological Survey Office, the same one that had mapped groundwater across the county back in the 80s, and asked if anyone could come confirm what they'd found. A hydrologist drove out 2 days later, took samples, ran a quick field test, and told them something that made Walt sit down right there at the edge of the hole. "Mr. Kessler, I'd want lab confirmation, but based on flow and mineral content, this looks like it's tapping the same aquifer vein feeding the wells on the Higgins property next door. Could be a significant vein, too, if it's surfacing this strong after 90 years dry." For the first time since the drought started, Walt felt something close to hope. That hope lasted exactly 5 days. Because that's when Roy Dell Higgins showed up at Walt's gate, not with a buyout offer this time, but with a water rights attorney and a claim that stopped Walt cold. That any water surfacing on the Kessler property, if connected to the same aquifer his wells drew from, fell under a decades-old prior appropriation, water right his family had filed on that vein back in the 1970s. A right that, Higgins claimed, gave his operation first and superior legal claim to any water drawn from it, regardless of whose land it happened to surface on. "I'm not trying to be unreasonable, Walt," Higgins said, standing at the fence with his lawyer's folder in hand. "But that water's been legally mine for 50 years. Boy just dug a hole into something that was never his to take." But there was something Higgins didn't know yet, something about to complicate his plan far more than an old rancher and his grandson ever could on their own. Because word travels fast in drought country, and news of fresh water breaking the surface after 90 years dry had already reached someone 2 counties over who'd spent her whole career untangling exactly this kind of water rights fight. Her name was Dana Whitcomb, a water rights attorney with the state's Rural Resources Division, who'd handled prior appropriation disputes across 3 counties. Disputes that almost always came down to one overlooked detail buried in decades-old filings. Dana called Walt directly after hearing about it from the state hydrologist, an old contact of hers. "Mr. Kessler, If what I'm hearing about Higgins' 1970s appropriation filing is accurate, I want to see the actual paperwork before his attorney gets anywhere near a hearing. A lot of these old filings were never as airtight as families like his have always assumed. For the first time in this whole ordeal, Walt had someone in his corner who wasn't family. Wasn't a neighbor, wasn't obligated to him at all. Someone who simply recognized what they'd found and wanted to see it protected. Hope rose again, real hope this time. But 3 days before Dana was set to review Higgins' original filing at the county recorder's office, Walt got a call. Higgins' attorney had filed an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order, barring Walt or Caleb from drawing any water from the new spring at all, pending a full water rights hearing. If it held, even temporarily, the spring would sit there useless. While Walt's cattle kept dying of thirst under a heat dome the Weather Service was now calling the worst in 50 years, triple-digit temperatures, no relief in the 10-day forecast, and a herd that couldn't survive on hauled water alone if the co-op's cuts continued. Higgins didn't need to win the case outright. He just needed to keep that water locked up long enough that Walt's herd wouldn't survive to see the outcome. And that's when Walt learned from Gus himself, showing up unannounced, guilt written all over his face, exactly how Higgins had found out about the spring in the first place. "It was me, Walt. I mentioned the boy's hole hitting wet dirt to his foreman over at the feed store. I didn't think it mattered, I swear I didn't." Walt didn't say anything for a long moment. Every piece slid into place at once. The allocation cut, the stalled appeal, Higgins' lawyer showing up right when the spring broke the surface. None of it had been coincidence. All of it traced back to an offhand comment his own old friend never thought twice about. The restraining order hearing was set for 3 days out. 3 days, with a heat dome bearing down, a state attorney arriving to review a 50-year-old filing, and a herd that might not survive the wait either way. Nobody knew yet how this was going to end, but everybody in that county was about to find out at once. Walt had 3 days, and he spent the first one doing something Roy Dell Higgins never expected a struggling old rancher to have the resources to do. He let Dana Whitcomb take the lead, and Dana didn't just prepare a defense against the restraining order. She went straight to the county recorder's office and pulled the actual 1970s appropriation filing Higgins' attorney kept referencing, instead of taking anyone's word for what it said. It didn't say what Higgins claimed, because it turned out the original filing, signed by Higgins' father back in 1974, claimed appropriation rights to the Miller Creek surface tributary, a specific, named waterway that had run dry and been legally abandoned, under state law, back in 1991, after going unused for more than 5 consecutive years. Under the state's use it or lose it water code, an abandoned surface right didn't automatically transfer to any newly discovered groundwater source nearby, even one feeding from the same underlying aquifer. Higgins Wells had spent 15 years quietly drawing groundwater under an old surface water filing that had technically lapsed decades before he ever drilled them. A fact nobody had ever challenged, because nobody had ever had a reason to look closely enough to notice. The restraining order hearing was scheduled at the county courthouse, a small hearing room that filled up fast once word got around. The same crowd, more or less, that had laughed along at the feed store, at the water co-op meeting, at Caleb's hole in the ground. Roy Dell Higgins walked in with his attorney, confident as ever, already halfway through a handshake with a co-op board member before he even sat down. He didn't know Dana Whitcomb was sitting in the second row with the original 1974 filing in hand. He didn't know the state hydrologist had submitted a formal report confirming the new spring drew from groundwater, not the abandoned surface tributary named in Higgins' claim. And he didn't know that Gus, pale, quiet, sitting 3 rows back from where he usually would have stood beside Walt, had spent 3 sleepless nights deciding which side of this he actually wanted to be on when it finally landed. When the judge opened the floor, Dana stood first. "Your Honor, before this court restrains anyone from using this water, I'd like the court to understand what Mr. Higgins is actually claiming." She placed the original 1974 filing on the table, alongside the hydrologist's report. This filing claims rights to a named surface tributary that was legally abandoned in 1991 under this state's use it or lose it statute. It does not, and legally cannot, extend to a separate groundwater source discovered on a neighboring property 30 years later. Mr. Higgins' company has been drawing groundwater for 15 years under a claim that expired before his current wells were ever drilled. The room went quiet, the kind of quiet that happens when 40 people realize they're about to be talking about this at the feed store for the next 10 years. Higgins' attorney tried to object, but the judge waved him off, reading through the 1974 filing herself. "Mr. Higgins," the judge said, "this filing lapsed decades ago under state law. You don't have superior claim to a groundwater vein discovered on someone else's property, and this court isn't going to restrain a family from using their own well during a heat wave based on a water right that expired before most of the people in this room were even born." Higgins' confidence didn't leave his face right away. That was the worst part for him. It just sort of stayed there, frozen, while everything behind his eyes fell apart in real time. "This is absurd," he said, too loud now, the confidence cracking at the edges. "My family's been drawing off that vein for—" "Without a valid claim," Dana said, "for 15 years, while your company sat on the water co-op board deciding exactly how much everyone else's herds got to drink. There's a filing with your father's name on it that says your claim expired before your current wells were ever drilled." And that's when Gus stood up. Every head in the room turned. Walt's breath caught beside him. "I need to say something," Gus said, voice unsteady but clear. "I've known Walt Kessler 40 years. I told Higgins people things I shouldn't have because I was scared about my own future, and he offered me a job. I didn't understand what I was handing him, but I understand now, and I'm not going to sit here and let him make this about a boy stealing water that was never his to begin with." The room erupted, not laughter this time. Something closer to fury, and it wasn't aimed at Walt or Caleb anymore. The judge didn't just deny the restraining order that afternoon. She ordered an immediate, formal review of Higgins' water co-op allocation decisions over the past 6 years, referred his expired appropriation claim to the State Water Board for reassessment, and set a separate hearing to determine fair allocation of the newly discovered aquifer vein among all the ranches sitting above it, a process that would, over the following months, cost Roy Del Higgins his seat on the co-op board, a substantial reallocation of water he'd controlled for over a decade, and his standing in a county that had spent years watching him ration other families' survival while protecting his own. He walked out of that courthouse alone. Nobody offered to shake his hand on the way out. The heat wave broke records that August, 112 degrees on the worst day, the kind of heat that killed cattle across the region by the hundreds. Walt's herd didn't just survive it. They thrived through it, drinking clean, cold spring water pulled from a pond that had gone from a boy's strange hole in the ground to the most reliable water source on either side of that fence line. Gus didn't disappear after the hearing. He came around most days now, quieter, doing the actual work instead of the talking, slowly earning back something he understood he had no right to expect quickly. And that fall, the State Water Board used the new aquifers discovery to reassess allocation for every small ranch sitting above that vein, protecting a dozen operations from ever facing what Walt and Caleb had almost lost everything to before a 10-year-old boy's shovel found something 4 generations of drought had never managed to destroy. Walt didn't say much when a local reporter asked him about it. He just looked out at the pond, full and steady even in the worst heat anyone could remember, watching Caleb skip a flat stone across the surface, and said the only thing that felt true. Told you, water don't disappear. It just goes looking for somebody patient enough to help it find its way back. That right there is why we tell these stories. If this one hit you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to The American Farmer. Drop a comment below and tell me, did you see it coming? Because I want to know. We'll see you in the next one.